I'm Sam Roberts of the New York Times, and welcome to the New York Times Close Up. This week, we'll be joined by New York Times theater reporter Michael Paulson. We'll discuss this year's Tony nominations and how Broadway's record-breaking season reflects the industry's complete transformation since the pandemic. But first, I'd like to welcome Columbia linguist and New York Times columnist John McWhorter. His new book, Pronoun Trouble, it tackles how pronouns became a cultural battleground on college campuses to Congress. John, you talk about the book is called The Story of Us in 7 Little Words. Why do those 7 words define us, and how have they changed the definition of us?
Well, those words define us because we use them as a stand-in for names, for example. You don't keep saying Craig or Albert over and over, you say he. Or you don't refer to yourself as Fred, you say I. And so you use these an awful lot, and they require that you and the person you're talking to share the same information so that you know what the pronoun refers to. And in addition, they change over time, and they tend to hit us where we live in that sense. And so there's a little story to be told about I, you, he, she, it, we, and they. And that's what I tried to do in the book.
And how has this changed in part with the Trump administration? Has there been a backlash to what other people would call woke pronouns?
Well, yeah, we are at a time when there are people who don't wish to be put into the gender binary, and they don't want to be referred to as he or she, and we need a new pronoun. And I get the feeling that a lot of people are delighted with the idea that we could create a pronoun of our own. It's kind of like we like to draw pictures of fantastical things. We like to come up with new ways of baking. And so people think, well, let's have a pronoun like heesh or something like that. That can't work because pronouns in a way aren't words. They're kind of the screws, the nails, the electric current. They sit so deeply that we can't wrap our heads around a new one. A small set of people might do the work of doing it, but it would never get beyond that small set. So we have to use something we already have. They is already a gender-neutral pronoun when you say something like, tell each student that they can hand in their paper.
But they
after.
is singular, is it not?
Well, the thing is, they is already used as both gender-neutral and singular, and it's been for a long time. We're told not to say, tell each student that they can hand in their paper, but we do. And so it's in our heads that they can be used that way. So if there's gonna be a non-he or she pronoun, the one that's gonna be is they. Now, there are people who are very uncomfortable with this idea that a person can be neither gender, and certainly the MAGA movement represents that. And as a result, even with this book, I wrote it in the summer of 2023. I wrote it as a happy book. I was thinking this is all, it's about the pronouns and the history that most people don't know. What
Little
a joy.
did you know.
And I had no idea that when it came out, people were going to be angry about they and them, but here we are.
And what about the use of X, MX, and other things like that? Are these far out fads, or they reflect, sensitivity?
Well, Latinx is a nice idea, getting beyond the gender binary in Spanish, where you have O marking masculine and A marking feminine. But, to tell you the truth, this is maybe arbitrary. Latinx is ugly, for one thing, and also very, very few Latinos wish to get rid of the gender binary. So what has happened with Latinx is nothing wrong, but it's a kind of an academic or artistic or activist jargon, which clearly at this point will never be used by anybody but them. I live in a very Latino neighborhood. I've never heard that word used by anybody in the 10 years I've lived there. So there's nothing wrong with a new jargon, but Latinx is never going to be standard parlance.
You wrote that there are not enough pronouns in English. What did you mean?
We are a pronoun-poor language, and so, for example, we're used to you being both singular and plural. We figure that's the way a language goes, but then if you think about any other language you've learned. One of the first things you learn is that there are different ways of saying you for singular versus plural. English just fell into that little hole for reasons that are not completely clear, but it means that we're deficient there, and a normal language often has dual pronouns. And so, for example, it used to be you could say I, you and I and other people would be we, but just you and I would be wheat. There was a word like that. Just to use was yeet, believe it or not. And languages do that. Languages can distinguish not only between he and she, but they really is supposed to have a masculine and a feminine, and some dialects of Old English actually had that. We are having to make do with much less material than a language typically does, and that's part of our they problem, that we have so few choices.
Is that part of American egalitarianism?
No, it was really just at a certain point people stopped using thou, and it would have been in England, and it was in the standard language, not out in the villages, but in the standard language, people started being very polite in a way and referring to singular people as if they were two. And suddenly the thou was no longer there except in archaic language. And we think, well, that's just the way things go, but it isn't. Actually, in other European languages, it's the thou word that is often taking over from the vous word, to use French as an example. But instead, for some reason in English, it went the other way, and now we're just stuck with it because thou is not coming back any more than Latinx is going to spread.
What about woke? Where did that come from? Why not awake or awakened? Why woke?
Woke started out as affectionate Black English slang. And what it meant, as far back as the 20s, actually, we're finding examples of it, it meant that you are aware of certain realities that especially a person of oppressed circumstances might want to know, that there are operations against you. And it was used in the Black community to an extent, way up to the end of the 20th century. And then it ended up jumping the rails and being used beyond the Black community, based in part on the popularity of a certain pop song. And it's been interesting watching the evolution of that word and how quickly it's changed, because call it, say, 2015, woke meant roughly that you were a good leftist. It was still a smiling word. And then, to be honest, to get into less felicitous things, I think a certain kind of woke person became rather punitive, and that became especially common after the murder of George Floyd in 2020. And so very quickly, woke became a slur. The same thing had happened with politically correct. I'm just old enough to remember when I was in college, people would just say it neutrally. And by the end of the 80s, people were hissing it.
That's
Same
right.
thing has happened to woke.
And is this changing now, or is the pendulum swinging back toward the middle?
No, it's not going to swing back to the middle. Woke has continued to evolve because now what it means is just punitive regardless of your politics. And so this new expression, woke right, makes no sense to some people because woke is supposed to be coming from the left. But now woke means that you're beating people over the head with your politics. But the days of woke having that kind of salty, smiley, sly and family stone meaning, that's gone. We have to have a new word for that.
We don't have enough pronouns, but you wrote recently in the Times that we have too many syllables. When people say a word like rude, it becomes rude. Why is that? Why did that happen?
The way that happened was that probably kids have been saying no forever. I'm sure George Washington probably said that when he was a kid. But using that started spreading to other words and then to the ends of sentences. And what we know is that it starts with young women, and that it started in the early 2000 teens, and you start hearing it on the radio and seeing it on TV and in movies. And it wasn't conscious, but people just started saying, you're being rude, I'm in a bad mood, you've got plenty of room. And things like that usually start with young women, and then they spread to men. There was an intermediate, actually. It was young women and gay men. I didn't write that in the Times because I figured why try to get it by. But it was that. And then nowadays
You'd be surprised what you can get by if you try.
Actually, I don't always like to try, so I just figured to leave it out. But then it spread to straight men, and now you hear straight men doing it too, whereas you almost never did 15 years ago. But it's been interesting watching it because you just see that, say, actresses are putting it into their readings of lines when you know that it wasn't in the script. And then you see the exact same kind of scene from something in the 80s, like, you know, Clueless, which actually was the 90s. Same feelings, same kinds of actresses, but they don't do the It's a change that happened only in the teens, and now it's just normal. My 13-year-old will sometimes just say, practically under the breath, she'll say, yes, sir. And that's like, now it's barely in quotation marks at all. This is how language changes. And then sometimes you lose the word thou. You never know what's going to happen.
It is fascinating. And you and I were belated visitors to the National Museum of African American History and Culture. I just went a couple of weeks ago. What did you think?
I thought it was a spectacular museum. And I went in not knowing whether I was going to like it or not, and I was just dazzled. The best thing about it is that if you do it right, you start in the basement, and that's where the slavery is described.
Do it
And you
chronologically.
keep going up, and then you're up into the light. I like the way it described all of the horrible things that have happened to Black Americans and that still do, but also told a positive story. You know, you go to some Black museums, and it's just all about hideous things and slavery and Jim Crow and redlining, and then some mannequins of people like George Washington Carver. And you just leave thinking, wow, I'm not feeling very good about myself. This museum was nothing like that. I thoroughly enjoyed it.
It was uplifting.
It was actually uplifting, yeah.
Yep.
People were smiling, and not just the white people. It was a really, if any, the only flaw is that there's too much of it. It's kind of like the Met. To really get it, you would have to go 3 times, and that's a good thing.
Does it address Black English or anything like that?
A little. I could have used some more. It seems what I saw was more interested in Gullah Creole and its contributions to the American lexicon. But frankly, those are kind of slight. And I was thinking, I'm not sure I see enough about the richness of the dialect. But that's understandable, because the richness of the dialect is something that I think America has only started to fully understand beyond literary types and linguists over about the past 20, maybe 30 years, when there was that Ebonics crisis in Oakland. Nobody had any idea that Black English was anything but slang and bad grammar. That's changing, but you know, the museum was put together 20 years ago. They could use a little more about language, but I didn't think of it as a major flaw.
What about racism in this country? I'm not asking you to talk about it, but why are we so hung up on race?
Well, I'll put it this way. We are hung up on it, despite a certain type who often says that nobody wants to talk about race and racism. Everybody wants to talk about it all the time. That's a good thing. We're advanced in that way. I think many people who claim that we don't talk about it or don't talk about it enough, or are waiting for there to be some hard left consensus that everybody agrees with, would be surprised if they went to, frankly, most other countries and saw how behind us they are in terms of addressing race-based inequities. We actually have come a long way in the extent to which we talk about it. Now, to the extent that I have my detractors, it's because I will say that I think there is a certain ironic comfort after a while, especially if you've achieved a certain amount of success as a Black person, in exaggerating the extent or the effect of racism. I think most people in America know very simply, a lot of people exaggerate, including now a lot of white people. And I think that's natural. There is a certain sense of belonging that you get from fashioning yourself as a member of a group of victims. It makes our discussion of race less constructive than it could be, because there's almost a reluctance to allow that anything has really changed. I don't like that, never have. But I think really what we have with that kind of exaggeration is better than what things were like in 1960, when most, educated people didn't think there was anything wrong at all.
English is now the official language of the United States, I guess. What difference does that make? Was it ever under threat?
No. I mean, the idea that we would need to make it official that it is the language of the United States is absurd. That's like saying that we need to legislate that there be oxygen. I mean, it's just there, and it's not going away. There are no people who are growing up in this country not learning English. If somebody immigrates here at 35, they're always going to have an accent. If somebody immigrates here at 60, they're probably never going to learn English. But there's no child growing up under normal circumstances who doesn't end up bilingual in the home language and English, or only speaks English. There's just no problem.
Is it any different from when people came over speaking Italian or German or Yiddish?
Not at all. I mean, and even back then there were people who were worried that New York was full of all these,
Benjamin
bastard
Franklin,
languages.
as you pointed out.
He didn't like how much German there was, and look where that went. And so, yeah, English is the world's official language, for better or for worse, and there's no way to reverse it. And to legislate English as the official language is really just a way of smacking Spanish in the face, and there's no reason to do that.
John McWhorter, New York Times columnist, and his latest book, Pronoun Trouble, The Story of Us in 7 Little Words. Coming up next, New York Times theater reporter Michael Paulson on the 2025 Tony race. We're now joined by a man who has one of the best jobs at the New York Times, theater reporter Michael Paulson. His reporting on this year's Tony nominations has brought to light the new voices, innovative productions, reshaping American theater. He's also been covering the remarkable 2024-25 Broadway season, attendance and revenue surpassing pre-pandemic levels for the first time. Michael, let me ask you about the Tony nominations. Anyone get left out who you think should have been included?
There's always a lot of snubs in this kind of situation. And sure, there were a ton of shows that got completely overlooked. I mean, you think about one of Broadway's favorite performers, who's Idina Menzel. She starred in a musical called Redwood, and it was completely overlooked. Robert Downey Jr. came to Broadway in a play called McNeil, completely overlooked. There were a number of those.
What did you like this season?
Look, I mean, I'm not a critic, so...
Yeah, but you go to the theater.
I see a lot of theater. I think the sort of original, intriguing musicals of the season include Maybe Happy Ending and Dead Outlaw and Buena Vista Social Club, among others. There's a number of plays that people are really excited about, including Purpose and John Proctor's The Villain, as well as a comedy called Oh Mary.
But you mentioned a lot of plays that are not as popular, not as well known in those categories. Why is that? Why are the other shows getting bigger audiences and Tony nominations?
Yes, I guess as with the Oscars, the Tonys tend to nominate the most artistically ambitious and innovative shows, and those are not always the ones that draw the biggest audiences. The big story of this season has really been the enormous success of a trio of plays, all of which feature quite famous actors. There's a stage adaptation of the movie Good Night and Good Luck, which stars George Clooney. The numbers that it's racking up are amazing. It made more than $4.2 million just last week, which is way more than any play on Broadway has ever brought in a week. There's also a revival of Glengarry Glen Ross, which stars three very famous actors. It's doing incredibly well. And there's a production of Othello starring Denzel Washington and Jake Gyllenhaal that has been selling most of its orchestra tickets for $921.
$921. First of all, how does someone come up with that figure? And isn't that outrageous as a price?
I mean...
I guess you charge it, and if you can get it, you do it.
They're selling out. It's not the highest price ever asked for a Broadway ticket, but the show's average price is amazingly high. People love these actors, love this play, really want to see it. It is causing a lot of conversation about whether Broadway has a ticket pricing problem. I should note, as you're aware, that we're living at a moment when people are paying a huge amount of money to see Taylor Swift, to attend the Super Bowl. There are a lot of live entertainment events that have very high ticket prices, but it's a challenge for Broadway and one that needs to be addressed.
But one of the things you've written that's fascinating is that as much money as many of these shows are making, and collectively on Broadway, not many of them make money.
Yeah, so I mentioned these three plays that are doing really well, and I think there are 6 plays so far that have been profitable. What I didn't mention is that musicals are having a really hard time. There's only one new musical that has become profitable since the pandemic. We're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars of investment money that is not being repaid. It's a really difficult climate for musicals. They're very expensive to make now, and they're not recovering that money.
Why do people put them on? Or is it like the producers, they do it to lose money?
I don't think they do it to lose money, but sometimes I think that investing in Broadway shows has become, particularly with musicals, has become more like patronage, more than it is a form of investing.
Everybody is a producer.
Yes. Now, the people who invest in these shows tend to be very wealthy. You have to have a lot of liquid assets to be allowed to invest in these shows, so they can afford to lose often the amount of money that they put into them. And there are rewards other than profit. They get to potentially win Tony Awards. They get to go to parties with a lot of famous people, and they get to feel like they're part of an act of creation in an art form that they love. And of course, they all believe that the show that they are backing is going to be the one that works.
Michael, one thing I never quite understood, unlike public corporations, Broadway is owned for the most part by private corporations. Why do they put out their financial statistics as detailed as they do?
It's been happening for decades, and it was a response to, it's essentially an investor protection method. It's a response to some fraud that was happening and misconduct. There was a decision that transparency would increase the security of this industry for investors, and it, for the most part, has done that.
Is Broadway back after the pandemic?
So look, this is the first season since the pandemic where the box office grosses have been higher than they were before the pandemic. Attendance is actually still a little bit below where it was, but not much. Broadway is doing, I think, better than people expected at this point, and the content, there was a huge number of new shows this season and quite a diverse array of shows.
You said every theater was filled.
Every theater had a show in it for the first time in years. And you know, you had everything from these small kind of avant-garde plays to these very large spectacle-driven productions like the Stranger Things play. There's quite an array of offerings. So yeah, there are a lot of positive indicators, but as you mentioned, profitability is down, and that's a long-term situation that will need to be addressed.
If you look at that array of productions, why are there plays, musicals in fact, about two corpses?
So this is an odd trend this season. There are a number of shows that involve dead bodies. There's a musical called Operation Mincemeat, which is about a counterintelligence effort in World War II that involved a dead body, and there's a musical called Dead Outlaw that's about what it sounds like, about the corpse of an outlaw, and it's just a coincidence, but it is a hysterical coincidence.
Is it movie stars who make Broadway these days?
I mean, it's everything that makes Broadway. Movie stars are definitely contributing to the overall box office take, and they are creating a level of excitement and attention that is positive. Movie stars tend to do plays. The musicals tend not to have movie stars in them, and musicals are a big part of what draws tourists to Broadway. So it's a stew of ingredients, but movie stars are definitely helpful. A lot of them in the last few years have talked about wanting to be part of Broadway as it seeks to recover from the pandemic. I think they see themselves as contributing to sustaining this art form of live theater. And also it can be a challenge. There's a level of skill required for stage acting that's different from that of film acting, and that excites many of these performers.
Is Broadway worried about threats to tourism from abroad? So many of those people go to the theater or want to get tickets.
Absolutely. I mean, Broadway's audience is predominantly made up of tourists. Maybe a fifth of them come from outside the US. And people are definitely watching closely what is happening with tourism. As you know, visitorship from Canada is down, and Canada has been a big source of audience. So we'll see what happens. In the past, when foreign tourism has dropped, domestic tourism has risen. And so I think there's a hope that that will happen this time as well, but we'll have to see.
You also pointed out, Michael, that plays, straight plays, are doing particularly well this season in a time when musicals usually do better. Why is that?
Yeah, it's interesting. When I started on this beat, people thought plays were going to disappear on Broadway, that there was no market for them anymore. And in fact, the reverse has happened. Plays have turned out to be an easier way to make money because they have a very limited runtime. Usually when you enlist a movie star, they can only give you 13 to 16 weeks before they have to be back on set. Having a limited runtime creates demand and excitement. Plays are developed more quickly so they can be more responsive to current events. And you know, we live at a moment when what people talk about as creating an event, a sense that something is really exciting, it's happening only now, and you go or you miss it. That's what plays offer, and it's working for them.
Why has Wicked been so durable, and not only durable, but seems to be coming back in effect?
Yeah, I mean, Wicked is another amazing success story of this season. Wicked grossed more than $5 million over Christmas week, which is more than any musical has ever grossed in a week, and it's been running for 20 years. I mean, obviously, a big factor in what's happened is that Wicked has been finally adapted into not just one, but two movies, one of which opened at theaters last Thanksgiving, and one of which is coming next Thanksgiving. And the marketing budgets for movies are enormous, enormous. And so there's been just a huge amount of attention to the Wicked story. And although I think once people thought, why would anyone go see a Broadway show for $100 if they can go see the same story on a screen for $20? The reverse has happened. The truth is that the Wicked movies have reminded people that they love this story and that they want to see it again and that they want to see it live. And not only on Broadway, but in touring productions around the country and in London, Wicked has been doing amazingly well thanks to the film.
I'm happy to say Ragtime is coming back in the fall, one of my favorites. Tom Hanks is writing and starring in a play. What else are you looking forward to in the next season?
Yeah, so the next season is just starting to take shape. Inevitably, after the Tony Awards, we'll see some shows announce that they're closing because they're not working out, and that will open up some theaters, and we'll see new shows. But as you mentioned, there's a revival of Ragtime at Lincoln Center Theater that promises to be very exciting. There's also a revival of Waiting for Godot, starring Keanu Reeves and Alex Winter, that I think people will be really happy to see. Kristen Chenoweth has a new musical. I don't know if you remember the documentary Queen of Versailles, but it's based on that documentary about a very large house and the people who built it in Florida. And you know, there'll be more to come if you stay tuned. I think we're going to have a lot of announcements over the next few weeks.
You'll come back and tell us more about that, I hope. Michael Paulson, theater reporter of the New York Times. That's it for this edition of the New York Times Close Up. For the New York Times and CUNY TV, I'm Sam Roberts. And don't forget to download the CUNY TV app. You can catch our weekly program on the go, anytime, anywhere.